And that's not judging what you were exposed to. There was an article in, I believe it was Time magazine, about a year and a half ago. And it was the cover story. And it says, white families don't talk about race. And the story was very interesting about, in a lot of white households, they don't talk about race. Why don't they talk about race? Because they think that it's racist to talk about race. Remember, part of our process in America is the melting pot, which means that we're all supposed to be mixed in together. So if you talk about race, maybe that makes you a racist. But that's the fear. Rather than looking at race as a mosaic, where everybody's color is there, but it fits together in a way that makes a beautiful picture. The way you deal with that is different. But acknowledging that it's there, as Salma said before, being here and starting this first step is part of the artillery and the weaponry that you use to come against decision making. Not necessarily just your decision making, but it can make it better. Obviously, by the responses to the questions early on, individuals are curious, individuals are looking to learn more about this, learning to learn a little bit about human nature, wanting to learn a little bit more about ourselves and how we make decisions. So bias-free decision making throughout the system is an issue. I just went to a forensic science thing done by the ABA and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, where they talk a great deal about bias in certain parts of the courtroom, different parts of the court cases, dealing with forensics and fingerprints and all that sort of thing. Bias is a part of our life. We deal with it every day, either implicitly or explicitly. The key is being able to step back and say, you know, there are certain things that I have to do based on the fact that I have the ability to exercise social cognition in areas, but I have to be able to divide what areas I'm going to rely on for that and what areas I'm going to step back and say, no, I need to resolve this according to guidelines, a checklist, and the facts and the individual is before me. And just because you do it well doesn't, yes, sir?
And to that extent, having gone through that whole process and analysis, you still may have the same pigeonholes where you wind up to be able to put whatever your outcome is, that despite the fact that you've gone through the bias filter.
That's right. Yes. But that reaffirms your ability to separate implicit bias and step back and assure yourself it just wasn't based on implicit bias. It just was based on the right thing. But it hones that ability to be able to step back and qualify as to whether or not this is based on implicit bias or best evidence or best practices. So as you do this, as you go through that thought process, you become better at it. And you can get to the point where you can identify implicit biases. I mean, we will talk in a little bit about tests that you can take to identify implicit biases. But I found if you study this and you follow through on this, there are ways, and we'll talk about some of the ways, that you can step back and identify some of the implicit biases that we may have. I have, and I've dealt with some of the implicit biases I've had since I started teaching this course, this curriculum. It's very helpful. Just the other day, and I guess it's because I had to raise children in the area, the time area. But just wearing trousers around your butt just ticks me off to no end. So I have to check myself. I mean, I was waiting for a bus, and this kid comes by, got a great haircut, looks good, but his trousers are around his butt. And I said, what in the world is he thinking? But then I stepped back. I said, you know what? I don't know where this kid comes from. I don't know what he does. You know, he may be doing something that's very important for society. And you're forming a judgment based upon where his belt goes. And I checked myself. And I've had to do some things in some areas that are less salutary. I've had to do it with LGBT. I've had to do it with white females. Those are some of the challenges I've had. We all have them. But I have to step back when we start talking about unearned privilege and dealing with certain people. I have to step back and make sure that my decisions are not based on any bias that I bring to that situation or anything that I was raised with or made more comfortable with or indicated that was more favorable or not unfavorable when I was growing up, and make sure that I make decisions, judgments, and assessments based on who's before me, the facts, in that situation. So implicit bias is formidable because we all have it, and it's implicit. And it's often not the same that we explicitly proclaim. You know, I might say that I'm for a society that is conscious of race, that celebrates race, but gives them equal part and time to that mosaic. Well, sometimes I don't always do that. I have to step back and check myself. So knowing that that's something that has to be done is a big part of the game. Now we'll go to the slides. And what we're going to do, I'm going to give you an opportunity to read the slides as we go through. We've covered a lot of what you will see. And if you have questions, I will answer the questions, but I'm not going to read to you what you can read for yourself. So we'll go through the slides. We'll give you a couple of seconds to look at the slides, and then we'll go on to the next slide. Let's sources, because individuals might want. If anybody wants to take down these sites, you don't have to write them down now because it'll be available during lunch to write down any of these sources.
They were also emailed.
Oh, good. As you can see, there was definitely a need to establish culture and cultural competency as a basis for getting into the concept of implicit bias. Next. I like this, and I am going to comment on this, because I think that this is a Salomonism. And this was great. A schema is sort of like a professor that's teaching a class, you know, who knows the subject well and prepared to jump in and takes and sees the situation if we let it. And it has its time that it's going to step in and take control of the situation and will grade and assess your conduct after it's over. So we rely on these schemas to predict and explain actions and to fill gaps and to fill in where it's less clear. Next. I didn't mention this and go into any, now you can go into great detail, but the experiences that you may have had with certain types of people may color your biases. You've had a bad experience with a certain type of individual, that's going to color how you approach a situation. If you realize that and step back, disassociate yourself from that, unclutter your mind and make a decision, you can overcome those things. Now, go back one. About 37 years ago, I was in my first year of law school. And my mother was having a problem with a tenant. And she said, no disrespect, you're a law student, you can't handle this. I want to get a good Jewish lawyer. I said, do you realize what you just said? I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not hurt by the fact that you would rather have a lawyer represent you. I said, but the fact that you want a good Jewish lawyer, which you think may be laudatory and may be complimenting that people in terms of turning out good lawyers, also has some implications to it that play into some stereotypes about Jewish people that we don't want to go there. My mother and I have had this talk a couple of times.
Even as a lawyer?
Even as a lawyer. There was a certain part of Chicago on Halsted Street. It was called Jewtown. I said, Mom, it's not Jewtown, it's Halsted Street. Some people find that offensive. So when you use that language, step back and consider what you're saying. Because you might mean, every ism is not intentional, and it's not meant to be negative. But there are implications that some people get from these things that we have to think through. And some of them, we may not see the reason why people take offense at. But the fact that we know that people may take offense is important. It's especially important to notice your messaging in your environment. The explicit biases are easier to deal with. Culturally, they may not be as easy, but at least consciously, they're easier to deal with. The implicit association test. This, I think you're going to have the ability to take at some point in time. It's important as you approach this test to realize that it's not a test that you take to judge. That's the reason why we didn't want individuals to take it before, because we didn't want anybody to think that we were judging individuals based on the preferences from this test. There are some preferences that come out of this test that people don't really anticipate. But it has a way of getting those biases or those preferences out in a way that are effective. That, I think that's been emailed also to the sites here.
It will be after this one.
Okay. Go ahead. You know, when I was public defender, I made the assessment to my senior staff that we were doing well by outside evaluators of minority hiring, but that we needed more Latinos in the office. And I was finding that the Latinos who interviewed for the office weren't doing well. And invariably I see avoided eye contact, didn't come across as forthright or honest or assertive. So there was some cultural indoctrination or training that needed to occur. Because a lot of folks from a Latino culture feel that it's disrespectful to look an individual in the eye. And a lot of them feel that it's not a good thing to boast about themselves or to market themselves. So I said, these are things that you have to take into account. Some certain parts of the world, looking an individual in the eye is not the test of honesty or sincerity or assertiveness for that matter. I said, we're going to have to look at a fact situation like the individual's not even there. And based on what their skills and abilities, how they answer questions, you know, because what if an individual crosses their arms and you were making a judgment based on the fact that they crossed their arms of how they're receiving what you're doing? Now, a lot of us have an orientation where we form judgments about that. But I know myself, I folded my arms because it's just more comfortable. Sometimes I've done it when I was kind of chilled. Some individuals were chilled in this room earlier. So you can't read that. You have to step back and say, you know, there might be another reason for this. But those are the things that we fall victim to.
Ed, what was, can you go back a second?
Sure.
Supervise? Something that none of us want to have. Does that mean what I think it is?
Yeah, determining whether a certain individual was the shooter as opposed to the individual who was aiding and assisting, aiding and abetting, because of the individual's background and a certain culture's propensity to shoot. Okay. Are there any questions up to this point? Yes, sir.
In your office, to use the practical situation you used as an example, you were willing to reorient your office as a way to get past the implicit bias against certain cultural indicators, black looking in the eye, and so forth. But is there not a secondary approach, which is to offer to all applicants, Latino and otherwise, you know, among the things you're looking for, and to discuss the importance of eye contact in establishing rapport and so forth, to making available to not just Latinos, but anybody else, what the indicators are that you consider to be positive attributes of the candidates that you're looking for your public defender's office, as an example, rather than change the standards from one group that may be different from others that you're interviewing. Would that not also be an alternative solution that might also solve that problem and not only that, but extend out to a greater group of applicants who may also be uneducated as to what it is you're looking for in important things, such as eye contact and being able to play up your own accomplishments and so forth?
That's an excellent point, and I agree with you because the training that I gave individuals was transitional until we would have the opportunity to go to certain law schools. We even went to colleges and high schools because we figured we were trying to recruit too. So we were hoping that even the high schools would be favorably disposed towards coming to our office if they were going to be lawyers. But we were teaching them these things. This is what an interviewer is looking at. So that generation, or younger generation, would know, even as they interviewed for a college, even if they interviewed for a job that wasn't related to us, long term, we thought that the solution was, as you say, to train individuals how to be successful in an area where everybody else can compete. But transitionally, we had to arm ourselves with knowledge that until individuals in their community had received this training and background, that we were going to have to be aware of the fact that looking off an individual may not be because of lack of assertiveness or truthfulness, it may be something else. So you're right. It's either or rather than it's both and rather than either or. Yes, sir.
So again, just as the way that we in here are talking about becoming more culturally diverse and culturally competent, the way I look at that is you've got an external group and you're doing exactly the same thing to them, right? You're telling them what is the culture of interviewing, what is the culture of the criminal justice system, what is the culture of a specific office. So again, it's always a two-way street.
Anyone else, any questions or observations? I just want to say before we go into this fact pattern, because I think we'll have the opportunity to do this again, that it's important at some level that we get your input as to how to deal with some of these challenges. So we have tried to elicit comments from individuals, especially from those of us who may not be as expert in the area of probation as some of our other of us, to get this information. Because this can help us in gauging where you are in terms of your understanding, but also as we teach other folks. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I think we can break for lunch and then come to that pattern. Would that sound okay? Only because
Sounds.
we probably would have break.
I don't want to stand between people and food.
People want food, you don't want to get in your way, so yeah. Okay, so let's.
So are you having working lunch back in
We
here?
are going to do a working lunch, so we're going to, why don't you all take some time to get your food, and then when you get a minute, look over this fact pattern.
In the materials?
Yeah, it's in your materials, and I'm going to put it up on the screen right now.
It should be just a couple of slides down. Right after real world behavior. The next one should be it.
So the proposal
You can.
I wouldn't touch it.
We've had an opportunity to at least look over the fact pattern. I'm going to ask you now pair off by twos, or if it's more convenient, threes. And what we're going to ask you to do is role play. Means one of you will be the offender, and one of you will be the probation officer and conduct that inquiry in the way that you would do it. And then switch. Because I don't know, if I was a probation officer, I don't know if I would look at this and say that there was a definite answer. But certainly from an individual who's not a probation officer, I don't know which way a probation officer would go. So, you know, there may be different opinions, there may be cut and dry, I don't know. But that's for you to decide. Switch roles, and how long should we give them for that? In about 10 minutes, so it shouldn't be very long, about 10 minutes we'll come together, and we're going to ask for a volunteer who will interview the offender up front here for us to take a look at and offer suggestions and input so that we can get through this with the maximum amount of input. So pair off at this time or come in the threes, however you feel more comfortable. And we'll give you about 10 minutes to do that. I'll give you a warning when we've done 5 minutes. Maybe I need to do a 3-minute warning for those of you who have 3. So I'll do a 3 and a 5-minute warning. And we've done this to give you a chance to talk about this, to think it through, so that as the interview takes place in front of us, and after that's over, not only can we comment on that interview, but also any thoughts you might have about this case that may inform the rest of us. What we tried to make clear throughout this presentation is that there are certain realities that we have to deal with. The harshest realities is that we all have biases, explicit and implicit. What we'd like to emphasize is the fact that there's good news, and that is that we're malleable. That means that we can change. Just like nobody is born with cultural competency. Everybody has biases, and implicit biases. But that doesn't mean that you have to accept that you're going to have implicit biases without putting checks into effect. Because you can put checks into effect. You can go from here if you have the desire to do so and be able to step back, as I've alluded to more than a couple of times, and be able to check yourself and make sure that the decisions that you are making are good decisions. And it's important what your motivations are. I mean, in our initial words, the words that you gave when we first came in here, I was incredulous because you did, in fact, do what you were told with the one word, which is the first time that's ever happened. Fairness was mentioned several times. So the motivation is to be fair. And I think that probation officers, excuse me, not only have the ability to be fair with their offenders, they also have the ability to be fair within the justice system. But a lot of it depends on your environment. Let me give you an example. A police officer catches an individual who's shoplifting. It may make a difference whether or not that individual has seen a gruesome homicide that day, had bad run-ins with other individuals, and is just overall having a bad day. You know, I can't imagine wanting to be a police officer because I don't know how you define a good day. You know, when your life is at risk, but how that individual deals with that retail theft and how effectively they deal with it may be that individual's ability to unclutter themselves of everything that's happened. This is an affirmative exercise in decision making to make sure that you remove all the clutter and you set the environment for making a decision. You know, I talked to defense counsel last week about the first interview with the client, that you have to plan the first interview. You have to set the environment. Whenever you're talking about interviewing individuals or contact with individuals, you need to plan that occurrence. And you need to be able to do that and decluttering your mind, setting the environment, limiting your exposure to outside influences and making a decision. That may determine whether that police officer charges that individual with retail theft or something more serious. Or if he approaches that individual in a way that excites more problems than would be necessary. So that you end up with that officer's safety is at risk. So a lot of that has to do with how you approach these situations. Can we go to the next? A big part of this may be procedural. It may be things that you design within yourself or within your office as steps that an individual needs to go through before they make these types of decisions. But it's important to be able not only to set those procedures, but to bolster those procedures in certain kinds of ways. One is education. You know, that's at play here today. Just by educating you to the fact that this is at work, I think arms you with the ability to make better decisions. I talked about uncluttering your mind. That's my term for reducing your cognitive load. Organizational review. Having somebody check over your work, or having a friend, or a cohort, or a partner check over and make sure, you know, was I doing the right thing? Did I approach this the right way? That's important. Debiasing.
And let me just add something to the organizational review. And it can be even higher level and higher functioning. And I'll use an example from my former position. And it's very similar to probation officers. In the criminal justice system, the folks with the highest amount of discretion on the streets, police officers, but once that's done, it's prosecutors and probation officers. So when you talk about organizational review and organizational structure, one of the things that was in place that I was working with prosecutors on, identifying what are the key decision-making points in your organization. Whether it's when you are interviewing someone to do a pre-sentence investigation, what are the different decisions you make at important reporting tracks, and actually, for example, collecting outcome data at each of those key discretion-making points. Most folks measure what goes in and they compare it to what comes out. What you know from what you do is before something comes out of the door, you make several key decisions all along that pathway that impacts what finally comes out. And creating an organizational structure where you're monitoring each of those key decision-making points helps you understand what you're doing. If there's something that goes awry, it helps you identify where you need to fix it. But more importantly, it also identifies exactly the types of things that you're doing right so you can replicate it.
Taking steps to de-bias. We've talked about this several times. That is stepping back to make sure that either by checklists or some other thing, or guidelines, or organizational guides that guide you to make sure that you're making a decision based on the facts and the individual in front of you and not because of some bias. Looking to other fields. You know, generally that's something that's appropriate. I would look to any field that does interviewing. I'll be honest with you. Personally, I hate interviewing. For an individual who had to do it for 18 years, because it's sort of like playing cards. But you wonder, I'm going to tie this together. When you're playing cards, especially when you're playing lists, you have to keep track of where all the cards are. You know, you have to know what individuals have played so that you can play the right thing. You know, it's the same thing with interview. You know, you have to concentrate. You know, I was a trial dog for a long time. I used to try cases all the time. But interviewing, it seems like you had to focus in a way where you had to keep track of things. Interview skills and what you do in an interview is an art. It's not easily developed. Next. Education is important. Several of you mentioned this in the opening. this in and of itself is important. And it's something that, this term is very, very important. A stare and not a blink, so that you can step back and view a process in a drawn out way so that you're sure that there's no implicit bias, because implicit bias is the result of a blink. In fact, I alluded to a book that was titled Blink, that deals with social cognition and how important it is. But we're dealing with the negative aspects. Next. The approach, these are the things that are offered as a way to make sure that bias-free decision-making is the order of the day. Higher level processing is just that stepping back and checking yourself. That takes a lot of concentration, and you need to be paying attention to what you're doing. You can't just roll through things quickly. You have to be of a mind to know that there are certain instances where implicit biases may take effect, and to be able to step back and check yourself. We've talked about all the rest of it.
Let me give you just two examples. For example, the micro messaging. Because sometimes I think concrete examples tell the story best. When I was in law school, my first year class had 425 individuals. Out of 425 individuals, there were 8 African Americans. Out of the 8 African Americans, myself and my roommate were the only 2 black men. We got along very well with all of our classmates. One evening, I had a bunch of my classmates over at my house for a study session. 3 of them walked into my bedroom, and on the wall, they saw my poster of Malcolm X holding an M16 that said, "By any means necessary." I cannot, well, you can imagine what the effect was. The classmate that sits next to me in torts has Malcolm X with an M16. Now, that image meant something completely different to me, because I was fully aware of the significance of the photo and a speech that Malcolm X made called the ballot or the bullet. But that was the micro messaging. I collect a lot of art, and I think I was in Charleston, and I came across an authentic sign that came from the days of segregation. And it said, "Colored only, no whites allowed." And I had it up in my home. For me, it was a vestige of history. It had a historical significance to me. After I put it up, every day for about 3 or 4 days, my daughter, she was about 5 at the time, would come in, look at the sign, get this weird look on her face, and walk away. And I'm thinking, you know, one day she's going to ask me about this sign, and I'll be able to tell her the historical significance. Well, that day finally came. But when she was ready to speak to me about it, you know what her words were? "Dad, does that mean my white friends aren't welcome in our home?" Be very, very alert and aware of how powerful micro-messaging can be.
Next. All of that is paying attention to your messaging in your environment. You know, there are things that you may be able to do in your home, in your room, in your man cave, or whatever. It may not be appropriate where you interview clients, or in this case, offenders, or when you message stakeholders, because it's the small messages that implicit biases have their transit through. You know, next. These are some things when we say stare, there should be stare, and not state, but it should be stare, not blink. Think out. Use checklists to make sure that it's a factual basis. Write it out instead of discussing it off the cuff. And again, and this is the fourth time in the last 5 slides we've mentioned this, reduce your cognitive load so you're free to make these decisions. Setting your environment is a very important part of being able to step back and check yourself. Next. Individually, and I'm going to end with this. I don't know how many slides we have left, but I'm going to end with this. In order to make this change, in order to get better in decision making, in order to make decisions that are bias free, you're going to have to make an effort to keep yourself accountable. Your boss cannot regulate your implicit bias. Your boss cannot really get to the core of whether decisions are bias free, because you've been doing this long enough that you can cover your decisions with whatever you think you need to cover them with. Individuals that are here have to make that personal commitment. Hold yourself accountable. But if you do that, and you hold yourself accountable, and you're able to step back and make decisions based on the facts, the circumstances, and individuals that you're dealing with, there's not a supervisor in the world that'll have any quarrel with the decisions that you make.
Two things. I guess the first where I start is by acknowledging that you guys are at a major disadvantage. What do I mean by that? We are packing into one day a presentation and a session that really should be given over 2 or 2.5 days. And part of that means that there are a number of little interactive exercises that really give you a better idea of how this process should work. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. The other thing is, as you were told at the beginning, part of what we envision is you someday putting on your trainer hat and interacting with individuals that you supervise. And I dare say, well, by a show of hands, how many of you think that just after this, you're ready to go back to your offices and start training? Exactly. But the beautiful part of this is, as trainers, you've got to remember that you're not the one who's responsible for bringing to the table all of this knowledge. You're not the one who's solely responsible for being culturally proficient. As a facilitator, what you want to do is create a safe environment for the folks that you supervise and that you work with. And you want to start facilitating a conversation and an exchange. And you can actually download, or we can send you a fuller curriculum that we use. So do not feel as though you have to burden yourself with all of this knowledge. And I guess the third point is to understand that we at the ABA will still be there to remain a resource for you, to help you customize the training when you're ready to train back in your offices. If you want one person to come out to work with you, pair up and do trainings together. But just remember, you don't bear the burden of knowing all of this information or knowing all there is to know about all the cultures.